So today I'm going to be giving you a little tutorial on how to join your binding strips together. I know a lot of people have trouble with this, getting it aligned just perfectly, so I'm hoping I can make it easy for you today. So I have my two strips, stripey binding, of course, always. I have a small straight edge, air erasable marker, and of course my little scissors. So my first step, I'm going to take my two strips of binding, lay my first strip facing up, take my second strip, and that's going to go face down. I'm going to overlap the edge just so slightly here and here. I do this because personally when I trim out my strips, I don't always square off these edges. I always score off the long edges but not the short edge. If you always make sure they're nice and square, you can butt it up right to the edge. For me, as a little safeguard, just to make sure it's nice and even, I like to do that small overlap. So I have them overlapped just nicely, just cornered off like that. I'm going to take my small straight edge ruler and I'm going to align it right across. Now make sure when you align this, don't make the mistake of putting it right to that raw edge if you did overlap. You want to align it right at this little intersection of the two strips on here and then down here, right at that little intersection. Then I'm going to take my air erasable marker and I'm going to draw a line right across. Okay. If you want at this point, you can add a pin to make sure that nothing shifts. I like to just do without the pin. I find it gets in the way a little bit. So I just kind of, once I get it over to my needle, I just make sure it's realigned again, that my line just goes across and lines up like it did. When you bring it over and you're ready to sew, keep in mind, don't sew exactly on the line. You want to have your stitch just ever so slightly over to the right of that stitch. So that is so when you open it up, you're going to get a much more even and aligned join of your two strips. So I'm going to bring this over to my needle, making sure that nothing gets off. Everything is nicely aligned still. Make sure that you use a small stitch length. That'll help also with your join to make it nice and neat. Always I'm going to do a back stitch at the front of my stitch and then also at the very end. So that's going to keep it nice and sturdy. Alright, do a couple of back stitches there at the end. Now, as you can see, my stitch is just slightly over to the right of my line, so I can still see my line. My stitch is just hugging it over to the right. Next, I'm going to take my little scissors and I'm just going to trim off this excess fabric that I overlapped. If you butt it up right to the edge because you had nice square strips, then just skip this step. But I'm going to flip it over, trim off this little section also. And then I'm going to do my last cut and trim off this excess piece of fabric here. Trim it close to your stitch. You want to make sure you're still going to be able to press that seam open. So leave a little bit of fabric there so it makes it easy for you to press open. So now we're just about done. If you open up your strips on the front, you can see we have a really nice straight bind join. And then, so I'm just gonna flip that over. I'm gonna finger press my little seam open. Of course, you can use your iron for this. I tend to burn my fingers when I press open a really small bitty seam like this. So I like to use one of these little rollers to get that nice and flat. That does a really good job. And there we have it. A nice joined binding. And you can just keep adding strips and keep going along.